Hello, it's Joe Simhart here again. It's June 19th. Today's topic has to do with a question by one of my subscribers who asked me to comment on Carl Gustav Jung. And if you haven't heard of him, you haven't been around much in the last 50, 60 years or more. So the reason I think he's asking me to comment on him is Jung is quite controversial in the sense that he extended psychoanalysis and the whole concept of psychology into a realm which we might call spirituality or the occult. Freud famously warned him about the black tide of the occult, but Jung and so many others didn't avoid it because it is such a huge part of human experience. It's not something that we can easily avoid. Anyone that says they feel like they've had a psychic event or, has had a tarot card reading is already participating in that world. So Jung, being young, became very curious about all of that. And he was also concerned about the fact that modern man had somehow lost the sense of a soul, especially in the secular world of modernism. And he, like a lot of others, wasn't happy with the old religions, taking off from Nietzsche's famous dictum that God is dead, meaning that the way that the Semitic faiths that were around and dominated Western culture became sick, in Nietzsche's words. So people like Jung were looking for other ways to examine the inner spirit, and he came up with things like the collective unconscious, and the shadow, and other terms associated with Jungian psychology. So my personal experience with Jung goes way back. In college, I read his book, Modern Man in Search of a Soul, back in 1968, I think. When I lived in Santa Fe, there was a lady I knew who liked my artwork, and she did Jungian therapy. He was a therapist that actually did therapy for Catholic monks using Jungian ideas. And so I traded for some therapy sessions for a painting I had done and got to know a little bit about Jungian therapy up close and intimate. So the comment I'm going to make is going to be very limited. Jung is a broad subject, many critics, but a lot of people praise him quite a bit. One of his critics that I'd like to introduce here, if you haven't heard of him, is Robert Ellwood, a theologian and a history of religions scholar, who writes about the politics of myth here, about C.G. Jung, Mircea Eliade, and Joseph Campbell. Now, I went from Jung, and I read all of Eliade, and I also read a lot of Campbell, and was part of that crowd of people that likes to say, I'm not religious, I am spiritual. So Jung, Eliade, and Campbell fed into that milieu, that clique of people that like to call themselves spiritual and so forth. In fact, Jung, because he participated in looking at what he called archetypes, which was different than how Mircea Eliade used archetypes, but I'm not going to get into that, but archetypes of the inner man and of the collective unconscious, that he felt that we could find these archetypes in our practices of using astrology, tarot cards, mandalas, this kind of thing. And so he himself explored this kind of approach. He also did some what we call channeling in his famous Red Book. But what I'd like to concentrate more on is his influence on astrology, and specifically through Liz Greene, who was born in 1946 and is perhaps the most famous astrologer in the UK, if not the most respected. She also became a Jungian analyst and has had a PhD in different fields, but her main practice is astrology. Now, I studied astrology back in the early 80s with a woman I knew and lived with for some time, and she was an astrologer. And she had Liz Greene books around. This is the earlier books that Greene wrote. And I was intrigued with her. I mean, she writes in a very intelligent way. And when I learned to set up a horoscope and interpret it, I looked at it through Jungian lenses, so to speak, the way that she might have. Now, I wasn't very good. I didn't practice as an astrologer, but I did learn the art and knew how to set up a horoscope using an ephemeris. So I have an article here about Liz Greene, a lecture that she gave at a Theosophical Society from online. And she said that Jung was basically a believer in the changing of the ages. And so that's why he was interested in astrology, because he saw this movement from Piscean to Aquarian age as something quite real in the zeitgeist, in the collective unconscious of humanity, and he felt that astrology and other things were indications of how this was going on. So she says something interesting about him, about his Gnosticism, and of course Ellwood also points out that all three of these guys have elements of Gnosticism in the way they approach the ancient wisdom or perennial wisdom or whatever you want to call it, the mythic archetypes. And she said that attempting to define the nature of his psychology to his associate Aniela Jaffe, Jung commented, "The main interest of my work is not concerned with the treatment of neurosis, but rather with the approach to the numinous. The approach to the numinous is the real therapy." So we're talking about Gnosticism, to that inner, deep spiritual sense of man. He also said something interesting here, or she says about him, Jung was not encouraging about the global problems that this shift from the Piscean age to the Aquarian age would entail. He placed his hopes not in mass political or social movements, but in the capacity of the individual to recognize the enormity of the responsibility involved and to engage in this inner struggle to achieve greater consciousness. As he wrote, "If things go wrong in the world, this is because something is wrong with the individual, because something is wrong with me." So this is where we get into this whole cult thing, because in general, the New Age cults and groups like that will bring you in this idea that we can transform the world, but in order to transform the world, you have to do what? You've got to transform yourself first. And here we have the techniques to do it. And so, you can use astrology like Liz Greene does to transform the inner self. And then once you get that work done, more or less, you can go help transform the world. So it begins with the individual. So in a sense, Jung, in his statement, flips the equation of the occultist, which is as above, so below. He flips it to as below, so above. So as we change our inner consciousness, so the outer cosmos changes with us. He's almost a follower of Leibniz and his monadism, and Leibniz posited mistakenly back then that there were these monads, or little existences, corpuscles is what they used to call them, that contained all of the energies of the universe, and that these things could kind of communicate with each other, and that's sort of like the mind of God throughout the cosmos. Spinoza had a form of that people call panentheism. I'm not going to get into all that here, but I just wanted to point out that Jung has a deep influence on these occult arts and on people that call themselves spiritual. In terms of the politics of myth, I'd just like to read one thing here, because Ellwood's idea, looking at the history of these three men, and he calls them the Midcentury Mythic Trinity. In this chapter 1, Myth, Gnosis, and Modernity, he points out rather succinctly that every one of these guys at some point in their early career dabbled in fascism or a form of it. They saw some value in it, especially Mircea Eliade, who belonged to a fascist organization in Romania when he was a young scholar. Now, all of them became apolitical or non-political and certainly disavowed what the Nazis did after the fact. But before the fact, they saw something good in this incredible psychic movement around the world that was informing communism on one hand and fascism on the other. The reason they liked the fascist movement in the 30s was that it included religion, it included spirituality, it included what they called the Volkish movement, the pagan spirit of a particular nation or its religious spirit. And they felt that this was myth acting in reality. And so they got kind of caught up in the fascist ideas of the time. And again, and Ellwood points out they did reject these out of hand. And so what he says is that the mythologists obviously were in the same group, same camp, so far as the value of myth was concerned. The question is, how concerned were they with its political in contrast to its personal application? He says the three mythologists under study, Jung, Eliade, and Campbell, were no doubt modern Gnostics all the way through, and they were not unacquainted with both political and intrapsychic Gnosticism. But my sense is that in the end, and only after some unfortunate dallying, they came down to an intrapsychic, not a political Gnosticism. They were certainly tempted at times by some version of the political Gnostic myth in the Vogelian sense, usually in its fascist form. But they came through bitter experience to agree implicitly with the ancient Gnostics that Gnostic wisdom was intended for the soul rather than the state, and they did not present any full-blown mythic models that could be enacted on the political stage. So then he says, but to understand why they dallied and may have come close to presenting political models based on myth and gnosis, it is necessary to look at their social context and intellectual heritage. So, we can go back to theosophy in a sense, which also dabbled in myth and the perennial wisdom, similar to what these three guys did, but they were much more scholarly. They would have rejected, say, what Madame Blavatsky came up with in her secret doctrine and elevated the discussion into more university level polemics and courses in terms of how they approached all this. But nevertheless, they remain more or less on the spiritual quest side of things, not so much on the history or the practical application of psychology, let's say in practice. In general, you don't see Jungian ideas being implemented much except by Jungian analysts or astrologers like Liz Greene. One last thing I'd like to point out is that this little small book here, it's a series called From Heaven to Earth, and this is Jung and Freud Return. It came out in 1979, and it was written by Robert R. Lightman, MD, through the mediumship of a Dr. D. Kendrick Johnson, who's a medium here. There's also another medium here. And what this basically is a document of a session of two mediums channeling Freud and Jung. And Mr. Johnson here is channeling Dr. Jung. It hadn't sold well. It's almost comical, but these people take themselves very, very seriously. I don't know what they were doctors of. One said he was an MD. I think the others might have been, who knows, chiropractor or whatever. But it's interesting that they point out that the person channeling Dr. Jung, Jung is saying through him, I'd like to make a personal comment here. I am looking forward to a very pleasurable task in the next few years. I'll be helping David, the medium, which is Mr. Johnson, on a project involving the symbols of astrology. And then Leichman says, do you mean an elaboration of the Sabian symbols? Jung says, through the medium, that and more. I don't suppose you know this, but David has read quite a bit in my works, particularly in Man and His Symbols. While he doesn't know the jargon, he has a very good intuitive grasp of what I was talking about. He tends to make his own labels, but after all, and the Leichman says, yes, a rose is a rose is a rose, and they all have a good laugh. Anyway, it's this is where it goes. When you begin to enter into the spiritual realm, almost anything goes, and Jung can be channeled by one of your psychics who taps into the Jungian consciousness. And in a sense, the astrologer can channel Jung through his ideas and symbols through the astrological chart, the horoscope. In any case, I think if you read The Politics of Myth by Ellwood, you get a pretty good idea that these guys have their flaws. They had a tremendous influence on what we call spirituality in the 20th century, and it's still going on in the 21st. So it's worth looking at them from this point of view, from their dabbling and dallying in politics, especially that early fascist impulse that they all seem to have. Thank you very much. Hope you have a good day.